Jim Jordan tried to bend the law in front of millions. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, didn't interrupt, she just waited. Then, calmly and deliberately, she corrected him, page by page. On live television, there was a moment of silence, unnatural stillness in the hearing room, right after she spoke. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but composed, eyes locked on Chairman Jordan. "That's not what the ruling said," she stated. "You misquoted the court. And, respectfully, you misrepresented the scope of federal jurisdiction. Under the Equal Protection Clause." It felt like the air had been vacuumed out of the room. The C-SPAN feed stayed steady, no cuts, no distractions. Just her, seated in a navy blazer, flipping through the printed court opinion. She brought that no theatrics. No shouting. Just facts, cold, clear, and devastating. Jordan fumbled through his notes, lips parting like he might respond, but she didn't need to raise her voice. She simply read from the Supreme Court's own decision, word for word. Her eyes lifted. Occasionally, not for effect, but to ensure every sentence landed. "It's one thing to have a difference in philosophy," she said. "It's another to misstate the law on national television, especially when the stakes are this high." It was just a Tuesday afternoon in Washington. But across the country, people paused mid-lunch, stopped scrolling, and watched the clip explode in real time. Phones buzzed. Comments surged across live streams. Legal Twitter lit up. An attorney in Sacramento posted, "She just did in 2 minutes what 3 years of hearings never could. This wasn't rehearsed." That's what made it land. You could see it in the way she held her binder, not like a prop, but like a weapon, honed by years of civil rights litigation. Jordan had tried to paint federal oversight as government overreach. Claimed the courts had spoken. Framed it all as political noise. Crockett reminded everyone what governance is supposed to be about: facts. Usually, the committee room is a mix of murmurs, scrolling aides, and shifting chairs. But not now. Even the aides looked up. Not because it was dramatic, but because truth, plainly spoken, doesn't need to shout, and maybe that's why no one could look away. "I'm not here to score points," she said. "I'm here to defend the law. And the law is clear. Oversight isn't optional when lives are at risk and the Constitution is being sidestepped." She didn't blink. Didn't stammer. Because this wasn't about ego, or going viral. The IT was about competence. Outside the room, media outlets clipped the moment within minutes. Some labeled it a takedown. Others called it a correction. But the truth? It was quieter than that. She wasn't angry. She was accurate. By nightfall, the footage had gone prime time. Commentators argued over tone, but no one challenged the substance. Because they couldn't. And Jordan? He looked like a man caught holding the wrong page. He didn't argue. Didn't misquote again. Just nodded slightly and scribbled something no one would remember. But Jasmine Crockett? She made sure no one would forget her. But how did it even come to this? 2 weeks before the hearing, no one outside Capitol Hill was paying attention. The Judiciary Committee was set to review yet another dry proposal, this time about federal oversight of law enforcement, but the fine print changed everything. A draft began circulating, a policy that would bar federal investigations into local police departments unless every possible state-level remedy had been exhausted first. It sounded procedural, bureaucratic. But Crockett knew better. It meant victims of civil rights abuses would be forced to wade through systems that had already failed them before the federal government could even step in. It wasn't reform. It was delay, and for someone like Crockett, a former civil rights attorney from Dallas, it wasn't theoretical. She had been in those courtrooms. Sat with grieving mothers. Filed motions. She'd seen firsthand how federal oversight had been the only path to justice in cases that local authorities had buried. So, when she read the draft bill, she didn't skim. She marked it up in red. She prepared, not for a sound bite, but for a reckoning. Behind the scenes, Jordan's allies felt confident. They framed the bill as common-sense reform. They banked on public confusion, and in most cases, they'd have been right, but not this time. Crockett didn't leak her notes. Didn't parade across cable news. She met with aides. Called legal colleagues. reviewed key rulings deep into the night. She wanted every citation to be bulletproof, even within her own party. Some whispered, "Pick your battles. Don't go too hard on Jordan, it won't help you later." But she wasn't thinking about later, she was thinking about families in Kansas City. About mothers who didn't know this hearing was even happening, but whose lives would be changed by it. The night before, she stayed in her office past midnight. Her shoes were off. Legal pads scattered, she wasn't rehearsing. She was verifying. On her desk was a photo from her law school graduation, standing next to her mother, a woman who worked 2 jobs and still found time to read her daughter's essays. Even if she didn't understand the legal terms, that woman didn't raise her to back down. So the next morning, as the hearing began, Crockett wasn't thinking about clips or cameras, she was thinking about the law. And about the people. Who needed someone in that room fighting with more than sound bites? Jordan. He looked comfortable. Joking with colleagues. Holding his printed excerpts, highlighted and bolded, but when he began to speak, the cracks showed fast, and Crockett was listening, because real power doesn't always speak first, sometimes it waits, quiet. Steady, until the moment the truth needs to be said, and when she spoke, it wasn't just a response to it was a masterclass. Jim Jordan carried himself like a man who thought he'd already won. He leaned back in his chair, that familiar half-smile curling, tapping his pen like he was counting down to applause. He didn't look at Crockett when he began speaking, just at his notes and the cameras. "This committee must ensure that federal law does not trample on local control," he said, raising his voice slightly at federal overreach. Then, as if delivering a closing argument, he held up a printed court decision, Exhibit A, in a trial he thought was already over, but Jasmine Crockett had read that same case. She hadn't skimmed it. She didn't cherry-pick quotes. She understood. It's line by line, in full legal context. That's the difference between a career politician and a lawyer who's been in real courtrooms, fighting for real people. Around the room, a few members shifted in their seats. Some scribbled notes, others checked their phones. Staffers lingered near the back, their eyes moving between Jordan and Crockett. They'd seen these exchanges before, loud, theatrical, forgettable. But this one felt different. Crockett hadn't said a word yet, but the silence around her wasn't passive. It was loaded. To her left, Representative Donnelly, an unpredictable centrist, whispered to an aide but kept glancing her way. To her right, Representative Givens, who had already tweeted twice that morning about government abuse, smirked through Jordan's speech. That smirk wouldn't last. Jordan followed his usual playbook, wrap a controversial policy in constitutional rhetoric, inflate a few rulings out of context, and sell the idea that scrutiny equals tyranny. It played well on the internet. But not under real legal review. And Crockett? She was legal review years ago, in a San Antonio courtroom, opposing counsel misquoted a regulation during a motion. Crockett didn't object right away. She waited until the judge asked a question, then corrected the record calmly, binder in hand. She won that case. And she learned something more valuable than timing, patience in a room full of men trying to outtalk her. So when Jordan finished and leaned back, expecting nods, Crockett didn't rush. She flipped 2 pages in her binder. Adjusted her mic then. "Chairman Jordan, are you referring to Thompson versus Jackson County, 2006? Jordan blinked. "Yes," he said, clearing his throat. "That's the one." Crockett tapped her pen once. On the page. "Because that case upheld federal oversight in instances of systemic misconduct, exactly what we're discussing today." A pause. Givens looked down. Donnelly stopped whispering. Respectfully, she continued, "You omitted the part of the ruling that clarified federal review was necessary due to repeated state-level failures." She looked at Jordan directly. "That's not an argument for less oversight. That's a warning about what happens when you take it away." She didn't raise her voice. Didn't accuse. But every word hit like a clean, precise jab. Jordan tried to respond. But now his voice wavered. "Well, that's your interpretation." "No," Crockett said evenly, flipping her binder around. "That's the court's. I'm just reading it." And then she did. The cameras didn't catch every reaction. Not the moment Givens crossed his arms like someone regretting a tweet. Not the faint smile curling at the edge of Representative Linford's mouth, a Democrat from Oregon who had seen enough hearings to know when someone was about to get fact-checked live, but they did catch Jasmine Crockett clearing her throat, flipping to the marked page, and speaking in a tone you could only call surgical. For the record, she began, the court stated, and I quote, in instances where local and state authorities have repeatedly failed to enforce or uphold constitutional protections, it becomes not only appropriate, but necessary, for federal oversight to intervene. She paused. That's page 12 of the Thompson ruling. Jordan looked down, visibly unsettled. That's not the central holding, Chairman, she added. I'm not summarizing. I'm quoting. This is the section you referenced, but left out the key language that changes its meaning entirely. That was the first clean HITIN congressional hearings. Noise is normal. People interrupt, posture, shout. But not now. No one said a word, Crockett continued. And if we're discussing jurisdiction, I'd also point to United States versus City of Parma, where the court ruled that pattern or practice investigations weren't just permitted under the Civil Rights Act, they were, in some cases, mandated. She glanced down to verify, then looked back at Jordan, meeting his gaze again. I'm not here to debate philosophy. I'm citing binding precedent. That's what matters here. Jordan leaned forward, hands clasped. The American people want less government overreach, Representative Crockett. That's what this bill is about. She didn't miss a beat. The American people want protection from abuse, Chairman, especially when that abuse hides behind a badge or a robe. Then she added, without venom but with unmistakable weight, and they want their representatives to understand the laws. They're quoting. That one landed. You could feel it. Donnelly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Behind Jordan, a staffer tried slipping him another document, anything to change the subject. He waved it off. He knew he'd been caught. But Crockett wasn't gloating, she wasn't there to perform. She was there to correct the record, and she just had. She wasn't smiling. Her face was still, her eyes steady. This wasn't a win to Jasmine Crockett. It was a correction, necessary, surgical, maybe even overdue. She leaned back slightly and let the silence do what silence does best, expose what just happened, and that's when the murmurs began. Not in the room, but outside it. On live streams. In group chats. Across social media, the clip of her dismantling Jordan's misquote had already been trimmed, captioned, and launched into the digital bloodstream. She just ended him. Law School 101, in real time. But in the hearing room, it wasn't a viral moment. It was quieter than that. And that's what made it powerful. She hadn't shouted. Hadn't postured. She made her point like real professionals do, not with performance, but with precision. Every citation was correct. Every fact backed up. And with every clumsy rebuttal Jordan attempted, it became painfully clear, he hadn't actually read the full rulings. I'm not questioning your intentions, Chairman, she said evenly. But when we quote the law in this building, we have a responsibility to be accurate. Otherwise, we're just playing politics with people's rights. Then she stopped. She could have gone further. Could have twisted the knife. But real power knows when to stop. Jordan muttered something under his breath and flipped a page like it might contain his escape route. It didn't. What made the moment resonate wasn't just what she said, it was why she could say it with such clarity. Understand that. You have to understand where Jasmine Crockett came from. She wasn't born with a microphone in front of her. She didn't grow up learning to interrupt or build her identity on viral moments, before the headlines, before Congress, before the sharp lines of tailored suits and nationally televised hearings. She was a kid in St. Louis, in a family that didn't have much, but believed deeply in telling the truth and backing it up. Her mother used to say, don't raise your voice. Raise your reason. And Jasmine listened. By the time she reached college, then law school, she'd already seen where the cracks were. The places people fall through unnoticed. She wasn't the loudest in class, but her notebooks were filled with annotations. She stayed late in libraries, double-checking her citations. Not to impress anyone. Because for her, being right wasn't optional, it was survival. When she began practicing law, it wasn't in glass towers or downtown offices. It was in cramped rooms with flickering lights, representing people who couldn't afford justice but needed it anyway. People ignored. People silenced. People failed by the very systems meant to protect them. She learned quickly. In those spaces, it wasn't about sounding smart. It was about being prepared. Ruthlessly prepared to SO when Jim Jordan cited a case he barely understood. Crockett didn't pounce. She responded like someone who had spent nights highlighting margins while charging her phone on a courthouse floor. Like someone who had once waited outside a holding cell just to get 10 minutes with a terrified teenage boy facing adult charges for something he didn't do at this moment. This was second nature. Her calm takedown didn't just expose a legal error. It revealed the gap, the chasm, between those who treat the law like a tool for power, and those who understand it as a lifeline for the vulnerable, because for Crockett, federal oversight wasn't an abstract idea. It was people. People wrongly pulled over, wrongly accused, beaten, ignored. She carried their names with her when she corrected the record that day, and the reason she could cite page numbers without blinking wasn't because she rehearsed them for TV. It was because she had lived them. Used those rulings in real courtrooms to shield real clients like Ronald Burns, a warehouse worker from El Paso, who messaged her after the hearing aired, "I saw you today. You're still fighting the same way you did for me. Thank you." That meant more than any headline ever could. The hearing may have been national, but her mindset stayed local. She wasn't speaking for attention. She was speaking for people. Even as the hearing moved on and other members began speaking, Crockett's tone never shifted. She stayed consistent, measured, focused. Anytime someone tried to muddy the waters, she brought it back to what mattered. Due process, she said, doesn't come with conditions. You don't get to pause it when it's inconvenient. That kind of clarity landed. It resonated deeper than any pundit's recap ever could, because she wasn't trying to win a headline. She was reminding the country, the law is not a prop. It's a promise, and the reason she looked unshaken, even as Jordan stumbled, was simple. She knew the difference between sounding confident and being correct. While millions watched online, something else was unfolding, far from Capitol Hill. A ripple across real lives. In Los Angeles, paralegal Tanisha Powell had the hearing on in the background as she worked on a police misconduct case. She wasn't really paying attention until she heard Crockett mention the Thompson ruling. Tanisha stopped, rewound, listened. That's not what the ruling said. She stared at the screen, then whispered, without meaning to, "Yo, she's actually doing it." In Austin, second-year law student Marcus Lee was halfway through a torts lecture, phone under his desk. He clicked on the clip, expecting the usual posturing. Instead, he saw clarity, authority, real law. He sat up straighter. In Springfield, Missouri, retired teacher Judith Barnes was folding laundry when she caught the end of Crockett's remarks. She turned up the TV, sat on the edge of the couch. "She's speaking like someone who actually knows what she's talking about," she murmured. Online, the reactions came fast, not Crockett quoting case law with page numbers while Jordan flips papers like he's lost the remote. No yelling. Just facts. Give her a law school. This is what representation looks like. And it wasn't just the accuracy. It was the restraint. People were used to sound bites and grandstanding, politicians treating hearings like debate club, but Crockett brought the calm urgency of someone who didn't have time to waste, because she had too many people depending on her. Cable news picked it up. Legal analysts from opposite networks agreed on something. For once, one veteran correspondent summed it up best: "We've gotten so used to chaos, we forgot what it looks like when someone just knows what they're doing." And for many viewers, especially women of color, it didn't just feel refreshing. The IT felt personal. In Milwaukee, 18-year-old Destiny Ayers had never watched a congressional hearing until now. She only clicked the video because her cousin sent it with a message: "She reminds me of you." She watched it twice, then just sat there, laptop open, not taking notes, barely breathing. Just watching, because for the first time in a long time, she saw someone who looked like her, not just in the room, but owning the moment, and it didn't stop there. Teachers showed the clip in civics classes. Professors replayed it in criminal justice lectures. Even some conservative pundits, while criticizing Crockett's position, admitted her command of the material was undeniable. On Reddit, a thread popped up. What law books is she reading? I want to read those too. But it wasn't about books. It was about preparation. It was about being told to wait your turn for years, and instead, showing up ready. That's why the moment stuck. Not because of a soundbite. Not because of a clap back. Because Jasmine Crockett sat at that table, listened, and when it was her turn, she cleared away the noise and brought clarity to a conversation politics had muddied for years. She didn't talk over anyone. She didn't insult anyone. She just did her job, better than anyone expected, and while the internet caught fire, Crockett wasn't scrolling headlines. She was remembering something far more important, a lesson from her past that made this moment land differently. Long before marble halls and committee seats, before national broadcasts and trending hashtags, Jasmine Crockett was sitting across from a mother named Denise Langford, in a small legal aid office on the east side of Dallas. The year was 2013. The ASC barely worked. The chairs wobbled. The intake file in her hand was coffee-stained from someone's night shift. Denise's son, Khalil, had been pulled over during what officers called a routine stop. He never made it home. The dash cam footage, which Jasmine had to fight tooth and nail to even access, told a very different story than the official report, but the local DA wouldn't touch the case. No charges. No internal discipline. No trial. Just silence. Denise sat across from her, clutching a photo of Khalil in his graduation robe. They acted like he was already guilty, she whispered. Like he didn't even count. Jasmine didn't promise her justice. By then, she knew better than to offer promises in rooms like that. What she offered was commitment, the kind that meant late nights digging through outdated law books, filing motions most judges wouldn't finish reading, standing in silent courtrooms where the other side smirked, knowing the system was already tilted in their favor. It took 8 months just to get federal interest in the case. 8 months of letters, filings, phone calls, because the local system had already decided Khalil's life didn't matter. Jasmine never forgot that. Not in 2013. Not in 2019. And certainly not in 2025, when she sat across from Jim Jordan. As he tried to gut the very pathways that allowed federal accountability to exist, that's what played in the back of her mind when she quoted Thompson versus Jackson County. She could still picture the courthouse bench where she waited before the appellate hearing, shoes scuffed from walking to meetings she wasn't invited to, no cameras. No applause. No social media. Just the work, quiet, relentless, necessary, because every name erased from police reports, court transcripts, and news cycles, they mattered. Denise Langford never got the resolution she deserved. The case closed quietly, but the federal complaint, though ultimately dismissed, triggered an internal review, 2 quiet firings and a shift in traffic stop protocols. It wasn't justice. But it was something, and Jasmine carried that something into every room where people tried to pretend the law was just politics dressed in Latin. After the hearing, she sat alone in her office. Opened a drawer. Pulled out a worn folder. The corners were curled. The name at the top, Langford, Denise. She didn't keep it for show. She kept it to remember. The truth has to matter more than the moment, because if people like her didn't get it right, who would? Her phone buzzed. Dozens of missed calls. Media requests. Text after text asking for her reaction. But she didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she sat quietly, remembering how easy it is to misstate the law when you've never needed it to survive. That's what separated her from Jordan. For him, the law was leverage. For her, it had been a lifeline. For her clients. For their families, for the forgotten. When she finally spoke to a reporter the next morning, she didn't mention going viral. Didn't frame it as a win. I've seen what happens when the law gets distorted, she said. And it doesn't hit politicians first. It hits the people who can't afford to lose. But Crockett wasn't the only one thinking that way across The country, people who'd never heard her name before were now asking, could this be a turning point? The clip didn't just go viral, it started conversations in places that rarely tuned in to see Spanned IT played on barbershop TVs in Detroit, echoed in classrooms in Tallahassee, circulated around lunch tables in Phoenix. Teachers whispered, "This is what civic engagement looks like." And for people like Aaron Felder in Fresno, a 26-year-old law student and former community organizer, it wasn't just a moment. It was a confirmation that he'd been doubting himself lately. Doubting the grind. The late nights buried in casebooks. Wondering if it still meant anything. He'd grown up believing the law could protect people like his mother, who lost her job after a wrongful arrest nearly wrecked her life, but after years of watching the system bend to power, he'd started to wonder if that belief was just naivete. Then he saw her. The clip didn't feel like politics. It felt like a reminder that preparation still mattered. That someone who looked like his cousin could sit in that chair, speak calmly, and shake the room with nothing but facts. He watched it again at 2 a.m. Then closed Twitter and reopened his legal ethics textbook. In a small community center in Camden, New Jersey, Miss Rivera, who ran an after-school program for mostly Black and Latino teens, played the clip for her students. She didn't explain it. She just let them watch. Afterward, one girl, Amara, quiet all semester, finally spoke. She didn't even yell. She just knew everything that mattered. Because girls like Amara are so often told they need to shout to be heard. Told to fight for space, but Jasmine Crockett showed them something else. Clarity can be louder than volume. In Columbus, Ohio, a father named Jerome was flipping pancakes when the local news aired a segment on the hearing. His 8-year-old daughter, Zora, looked up from the kitchen table, pointed to the TV, and asked, "Daddy, is she a judge?" "No, baby," he said, smiling. "She makes the rules the judges follow." Zora blinked, wide-eyed. "I want to do that." And that, more than any tweet, headline, or think piece, is why the moment landed so hard, because beyond the talking points and partisan spin, there were real people watching. Ordinary folks who, maybe for the first time, saw themselves not as symbols. Not as an afterthought. But as a presence. As power, someone who didn't ask for permission to speak, but earned her voice through the kind of work that never makes the evening news. Even her critics felt the shift. On a conservative talk radio show in Kansas City, a host known for railing against radical leftists surprised his listeners. "Look, I don't agree with her politics," he said. "But she made her argument and backed it up. That's rare these days. You've got to respect that." And that respect didn't come because she demanded it. It came because she walked into a space people expected her to tiptoe through. And redefined it. While the news cycle moved on, as it always does, Crockett's moment didn't fade. It lingered. Not as a headline, but as a benchmark. Across the country, people who'd long felt invisible in civic conversations were suddenly saying her name in school projects, dinner debates, college applications, and quiet daydreams. And the irony? She hadn't changed a thing. No softened tone. No rehearsed message. No curated performance. She was just Jasmine. The same woman who once walked into courtrooms with borrowed binders and out-researched every lawyer in the room. The only difference now was that millions of people saw what that looked like, inside the Capitol. Though, the impact was immediate and undeniable. The morning after the hearing, Jim Jordan arrived earlier than usual. His shoulders were tight. His expression blanked. No press availability. No tweets. No spin. Just silence. Jordan's instincts had always been sharp. But even he knew, there was no salvaging what happened in that room. The headlines weren't kind. Crockett corrects the record, Jordan schooled on federal law, Congresswoman delivers legal clinic in real time. Cable news ran the footage on loop. Legal analysts weren't talking about zingers. They were talking about an embarrassing lapse in legal comprehension. Some even asked, if the Judiciary Chair can't correctly cite precedent, how can he credibly lead on law enforcement reform? Behind closed doors, staffers scrambled, reviewing transcripts, measuring the damage. Committee members, even a few Republicans, began quietly distancing themselves from the bill. One asked a staffer, "Does Crockett have a copy of her notes? I'd like to review them." Meanwhile, Crockett remained quiet. She gave one interview, on public radio. "I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone," she said. "I just wanted to be accurate. Because when we misrepresent the law, we're not the ones who suffer. The people outside this building do." But pressure was building. Activist groups, many of whom had been pushing reform for years, suddenly had a clip, a soundbite. A champion, civil rights organizations blasted out Crockett's exchange with petitions and fundraisers. In Tulsa, one group launched a local ad campaign featuring her quote, "Oversight isn't optional when the Constitution is being sidestepped." Something had shifted. A committee phones rang off the hook. Staff inboxes flooded, but this time, the messages weren't just angry. They were informed, constituents quoting rulings, citing page numbers, asking follow-ups, demanding clarity. Hive never seen so many people reference Supreme Court precedent in an email, one aide said. She didn't just speak, she educated a whole section of the country in 5 minutes. And then came the press conference. Jordan stepped up to reclaim the narrative. "We believe in robust debate," he said, "and differing interpretations of legal precedent. That's how democracy works." It landed flat. Reporters pounced. "Which part of the Thompson ruling supports your claim, Chairman?" He hesitated, flipped through his notes, then pivoted, but by then, it was too late. The truth was already out there. And Jasmine Crockett had made sure it had receipts. Did Jordan ever admit the sections Crockett cited were accurate? Not quite. He dodged, repeated talking points, offered nothing new, but by that afternoon, the tide had shifted. Several key lawmakers announced they could no longer support the bill as written. A few moderate Democrats, who had stayed on the fence for weeks, publicly credited Crockett's explanation for helping them make up their minds. Behind closed doors, staff were already drafting revisions, tighter safeguards for federal oversight, clearer language to prevent exactly the kind of misreading Crockett had called out. The IT wasn't a total win. Not yet. But the conversation had changed. And Jasmine Crockett? She returned to work like nothing happened. She showed up early to a budget subcommittee meeting, took calls from constituents, declined every network request asking her to recreate the moment. Because she knew the power wasn't in the clip, it was in the clarity. It was in reminding the country what a serious conversation about law should sound like. Later that week, her staff gathered in her office over takeout, tired but proud. Someone joked, "We should frame that binder." Crockett smiled, shook her head. "We're not done," she said. "We were just finally heard." She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't insulted anyone. She just refused to be minimized. And that made all the difference. But the truth? This wasn't about one hearing or one bill. The IT was about what happens when someone walks into a room not just with passion, but with preparation. In a town built on bluster, that's more rare than it should be. A few weeks later, the clip had faded from the headlines. New controversies, new distractions. But something about that moment stuck, because in a time when politics often feels like a race to be the loudest, the meanest, the fastest, what Jasmine Crockett did was quietly radical. She showed up, told the truth. No stumbles, no theatrics, just facts, just law, and she did it better than the man who tried to twist it. She reminded the country, competence still matters. Preparation still matters. Truth still matters. People are tired of the performance, of politicians confidently citing things they haven't read, of policies that hurt the very people they claim to protect. Crockett didn't just push back. She offered a blueprint, not perfect, not polished, but grounded. Earned. That's why it hit so hard, because across dinner tables, classrooms, and community meetings, people weren't just reacting, they were learning. Students asked teachers, "Can we talk about what she said?" Organizers began using her words to frame demands. Even in Congress, the tone shifted. More members started reading the fine print. More staffers double-checked citations, and though no one said it aloud, the preparation level quietly went up. Because no one wanted To get caught like Jordan, flat-footed, off-balance, and exposed, Crockett didn't come from legacy. She didn't have a machine behind her. What she had was experience, time in underfunded courtrooms with flickering lights and outdated printers. Time studying case law at 1 a.m. because her client's freedom hinged on catching a technicality. Time understanding the system so well, she could hold her ground anywhere, not with ego, but with evidence. That example? It wasn't just political, the IT was personal, because we've all been in that room, the one where someone louder, more powerful, but less informed tries to take control. That we've all watched someone twist facts, bend rules, shift blame, and we've all wondered what it would feel like to stand up and say, that's not true, and here's why. That's what Jasmine gave people, a blueprint. You don't have to be the loudest. You don't have to be the most liked, but if you do the work, if you know your stuff, you can stand in any room and not flinch. She didn't show up to destroy anyone. She showed up to defend the law, and she proved there's a difference between pretending to understand the law and actually knowing it. But that's the lesson. In a world full of performance, don't perform. Prepare. Do the work. Stand on what you've earned, because when the time comes, and it will, you won't need to shout. You'll just need to speak clearly. And the room will go quiet. So whether you work in law, education, medicine, advocacy, or anywhere someone might try to talk over you, remember this: you don't need to be louder. You just need to be ready. And if this story moved you even a little, share it. Use it. Teach it, and most of all, remember it the next time you find yourself in a room where the truth needs to be said out loud, because it still matters. And people like Jasmine Crockett are proving that it always will.